Good evening, friends, and welcome to Sleepy Time Tales, a podcast intended to help you sleep. Do you find your mind plagued with the stresses of modern life, especially when you're laying yourself down for a restful night? Does your mind spin and churn? Follow my voice down the path towards a restful night. Listen to me tell a story that will keep your mind from wandering to your daytime problems, the ones that you can't solve right now, and will be easier to solve with a solid night's rest. Listen to my voice and allow yourself to drift, following the twists and turns, but slowly letting go and drifting into the deep night, the restful sleep, a mindset of focused relaxation rather than the spinning confusion many of us insomniacs face at night. Before we go any further together tonight, I need to take care of some business. It's the sort of thing that usually happens towards the end of most podcasts, but since I'm hoping you're asleep by the time we get that far, I need to mention this stuff now. Firstly, you can find the podcast, all episodes, as well as some blog posts and musings on the website sleepytimetales.net. Comments, questions, suggestions can all be emailed to contact@sleepytimetales.net. You can also find links to all the relevant social media there, but you can find the show on Twitter @SleepyTimeTales and our Facebook page at facebook.com/SleepyTimeTalesPodcast. There's also a channel on YouTube where I am uploading simple visualizer enhanced versions of the episodes for your enjoyment. Search for Sleepy Time Tales Podcast or follow the link in the show notes. Also in the show notes and on the website is a link to the podcast newsletter. You can sign up and I will send you a weekly update with the latest episodes, blog posts, and maybe relevant specials or links to resources or stores that sell sleep aids, if I find anything that I think is worthwhile sharing. Now, if you're enjoying the show and or finding it useful, if it's helping you a couple of nights a week, or if you leave it running in the background so my droning voice can sing you to sleep, I would appreciate a little bit of support. I was going to hold off a few months on starting a Patreon because I wanted to have a body of work to justify it first, but they recently announced some changes that will make it more expensive and less useful for new creators starting campaigns after May 2019, so I figured I would just hold my nose and jump in and get started. So the show is free. What reason could you have to pay me for it? Well, there are a couple. Firstly, maybe you'd just like to. It's a service I provide mainly to help people out, and if you think that it's something you'd like to support and you're finding it useful, that may be reason enough. But I'm also happy to sweeten the pot for a little bit of support, so I do have some rewards levels available. There are 3 at the moment, and I'm keeping things simple. So if you can afford $1 a month, I will genuinely appreciate that. I live in a country where $1 is actually a usable amount of money, so if you want to back me at that level, I will, with your permission, list your name or alias on a thank you page on the Sleepy Time Tales website, sleepytimetales.net. Now, while a single $1 is genuinely a usable amount of money to me, add 4 more to that to make 5, and we have a very useful amount of money. To thank you for reaching that deeply, I will provide you with an RSS feed of episodes that don't have this section in it, where I'm rattling a can at you asking for your spare change. Also, while I don't currently have any advertising on the show, that may change in the future, and $5 and up patrons will receive ad-free episodes in their feed. If you really love what I do and can kick $10 a month in my direction, you will get an extra episode every month. I'll do a movie recap/review that will be chosen in a poll by users at the $10 or higher levels. That's assuming if I come up with something that I feel is worthwhile for higher level patrons, but now $10 is the cap. You can find the Patreon on patreon.com/sleepytimetales or on the website sleepytimetales.net/patron. If a monthly commitment is a bit much for you, I do have a tip jar up in the website, where you can throw a bit of spare change my way whenever you're so inclined. And again, I'll repeat myself, literally a single $1 is useful. If that's what you can afford and you feel it isn't going to help, be reassured it will, and it will be appreciated. Another way you can help without even costing yourself anything extra is checking out the affiliate links on many episodes and on the website. I link to items that are related to the theme of an episode in the show descriptions, and the website has links to sleep aid podcasts, appliances, and even some very nice looking beds, so go take a look if you're on the market. Also, if you're so inclined, please rate and review the podcast on whatever your podcast delivery service of choice is. The show can be found on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, and SoundCloud, but of course you already know that because you've found it already. A 5-star review will get the show in front of more people, and the more people who find it, the more people I have a chance of helping to find a good night's sleep. Also, any interesting or funny reviews I get will be read out at the end of an episode, so there's a little bit of extra motivation for you. If this show helps you to find a good night's sleep, it may help others as well, so other than reviews, also please share this show on your social media or to your friends and family. It may even help others if it doesn't help you. Everyone who suffers sleepless nights is usually open to options that may work for them, even if it doesn't necessarily work for others. The music in this episode and all episodes thus far is Un Désert by Kumiku. Their music is available on the Free Music Archive. I've linked their website and their Patreon in the show notes, as they have some very cool stuff released under various different names that I recommend checking out. Now that business is taken care of, let me run through the introduction and explain exactly what this podcast, a sleep aid podcast, is for. I discovered far too late in life that droning male voices have a tendency to put me into a deep sleep. I learned this when I was listening to video game podcasts and Welcome to Night Vale at bedtime, or sometimes even during the day when I was at home because I was doing shift work. Eventually I found out that sleep podcasts are a thing. I tried one out and it worked very well for me, but when I recommended it to other friends, they didn't like the narrator's voice. So I wondered if I could do an alternative, and here it is. This intro will go on for a few minutes as I explain the idea behind the podcast and why I think that listening to me will help you. Then after the intro, the story will begin. Before the story starts, maybe try to wind down, grab a glass of water, turn out the lights, and prepare yourself for the experience of sleeping as we prepare to go on a journey together to a restful night's sleep. Or maybe it's not a journey, maybe we're building a space for you, a mental nest to settle into. The idea is that you don't listen to me too closely unless you find me that fascinating, but I don't think that will happen. The story I will tell is going to be confusing and pointless and maybe a little boring, and hopefully it creates a state of mind of peaceful resignation, an acceptance of that state of mind, a lack of resistance to the arms of sleep as they reach out to you. So listen to the sound of my voice as I tell you a tale. Tonight is a story about Buddy, the little boy who made friends with a bear in our very first episode. At first I planned on doing a series about Buddy meeting different animals in the woods, initially based on the news story from a while back about the toddler who disappeared from his parents' house in North Carolina. He was found 3 days later claiming he'd hung out with a bear. By the time I finished my first story though, I realized this wasn't going to work. While my plan is to bore you to sleep, these stories can't be so terrible that you don't even get to the end of the first episode. Or start it. And repeated stories of a young man, no matter how charming, wandering about the woods with a random tolerant animal of the week could wear thin pretty fast. So I decided to abandon too much reality. I'm going for something like magical realism, or maybe just a modern-day fairy tale with stories about Buddy. So tonight, he's going to meet the gnomes that live in his yard. As I said, I hope that you're asleep before our planned time is up, but don't feel pressurized. It may not work on the first night. Maybe it will take a few nights for you to get used to listening to my voice. Maybe my accent is strange to you. Maybe one episode just isn't long enough. I'm going to assume here that this podcast goes undiscovered for an extended period. The chances of a lot of people discovering this in the first few days, weeks, or even months is pretty slim. If you've discovered this, I'll probably have a bit of an archive for you to listen to. New episodes will be released every Sunday night to give you something fresh to help you rest in a new week, but I'm also going to be trying in my first few weeks and months to release a few extra episodes to help build up an archive, so that you, the listener, has a full night's worth of stories to leave running in the background. So keep an eye out once you've subscribed to see what new stuff I release. So queue up a few episodes or just run through the backlog. I keep mentioning leaving it playing in the background because that's what I do with sleep podcasts. I just let them stream all night. I'll lie down in the dark with my earbuds in and I let them run. Sometimes I wake up at 3 a.m, the stream's still running, and I let the voices waft me back to sleep. Sometimes it may be disconnected and I need to start again, but it always works for me. Sometimes I wake up 30 minutes before my alarm goes. Usually when this happens, I just carry on listening and I fall back asleep. Let me tell you now, that 30 minutes is sometimes the most relaxing part of my night. There's something about allowing yourself to relax completely right before the alarm that just satisfies on a deep, deep level. So you have the basic idea. You relax and you lie in the dark, and while I do that, I tell you a tale. It might be a story I make up. It might be me talking about a movie or TV show I find interesting, but not too interesting. I may get some weird news stories and waffle on for a while about how they make me feel or what I think. I mean, our first episode was Buddy. The story of Buddy was based on something like a weird news story that I used to just make up into something else afterwards. This is all quite new to me, so I don't want to decide yet what my rules are, but I'm starting to get an idea of the structure that I'm building towards. If you, the listener, find some types of things work better than others, feel free to let me know through either my social media or the email that I provided earlier. So lie there in the dark, let my voice wash over you. Listen to things you find interesting, but try not to listen too closely. If you're too engaged, that may prevent you from falling asleep, so I'll try my hardest not to be too interesting, which a lot of people I know will tell you shouldn't be that hard. I do have the habit sometimes of going on and on about things I find interesting, but nobody else does. But I'm using that to turn into a benefit for you, the listener, my nighttime friend who has elected to lie in the dark listening to my voice. Thinking about that, it does sound a bit strange, doesn't it? You inviting me, a stranger from somewhere in the world, probably far away, to speak to you in your sleep, to speak you to sleep. But you'll always be safe with me. I'm here to help you relax, to improve your life in a small way, or maybe not even so small. People don't sleep very well these days, and it makes their lives harder. So I'm here to do my small part to help you in a big way, to help you to face tomorrow and the day after well rested and better able to cope and process. I'm not going to tell you horror stories or ghost stories, unless maybe they're funny. You know, the rare humorous haunting. I'm not going to focus on any of the bad parts of modern life that already keep us awake. I mean, they're already keeping you awake, so why would I do that? I will only share stories that relax or make your life better, even in small ways. I believe very strongly in the benefits of kindness. I want to be kind to you. I want to share kindness with you. I want you to be kind to yourself. Don't beat yourself up or rebuke yourself up over not sleeping. Don't get tense and frustrated if you just can't get yourself over the edge of sleep, even with me here in your ears trying to help. Forgive yourself. And if I don't seem to be helping, ask that you forgive me, because holding it against me or yourself won't help you and will just make you more frustrated. Take a breath, forgive the fact that you can't sleep, and let my voice wash over and under you. Take another breath. Imagine the warm darkness rising up, inviting you to sleep into a better life starting tomorrow. And if you can't let go, forgive yourself and try again tomorrow. If you've had a life of insomnia, sleep is something like an enemy. But it is not your enemy. It is a natural process that we have been pulled away from by stress and life and the supposed progress of modern life shining bright lights in our eyes at all hours. I'm here to work with you. Together we'll create a safe space, a cocoon in which you can curl up and allow nature to take its course. So if you're still with me, thank you for staying. If you're already asleep, we'll chat again soon. And of course you aren't hearing me except maybe in a dream. So let your dreams be about the story that I'm about to tell you now. Buddy and the Gnomes. Buddy had many adventures as he grew up. In his home that was surrounded on three sides by thick forest, the home with the single dirt road winding up from the main tarred road. Sometimes his adventures were in the woods. Many times he met up with the creatures, animals, and some more mysterious beings deep in the trees, in the sun and the shade, kissed by the breeze and the smell of life. Many times adventures came to find him, though, or he encountered it in the corner of his own yard, in the garden that was well kept but large and filled with dark corners and ancient sheds and the large fading red barn. There was something magical about the deep, deep forest in which he lived, and the clearing with the house and the yard. Maybe the magic was real, or maybe it was the vivid imagination of the young boy. Maybe he really did meet a group of gnomes living in the barn in the backyard of his house, near the split-post fence that kept large, lazy creatures out of the habitations of the people. It's probably not right to call the fading red-painted building a barn, although it definitely looked like one. They weren't on a farm, after all. There was no tractor or no livestock that slept in the barn. It would probably more correctly be called a garage or a workshop, or a garage and workshop. It was, after all, big enough to be both. It had Buddy's grandfather's old truck, a much-loved old Ford that he had driven for many years, and that Buddy's father still cherished. It also had another old car, a project of Buddy's dad's, something for him to fiddle with and swear at over the weekends. Buddy liked to sneak in and listen to his dad grumble and use the words that Buddy wasn't supposed to know. He also liked to listen to the music playing on the old radio, the jangly, fast stuff, very unlike the smooth, gentle music his mother preferred most of the time. Although when she was home with Buddy and no one else was there, she also liked to crank up the music and they would jump around the house to rough beats and crunchy guitars. So gnomes. Gnomes, or something like them, are in many mythologies from around the world. Initially, the term was used interchangeably with goblins to refer to subterranean creatures that mined precious treasures and guarded them jealously. The term was popularized by the Swiss alchemist Paracelsus, who claimed that the creatures were earth elementals, who could move through solid ground like fish move through water. He may even have invented the word. Gnomes have been created and recreated through much of popular media. They have appeared in everything from L. Frank Baum's Oz books as villains, as well as his life and adventures of Santa Claus in the more classical Earth Spirit guise, up more recently to Harry Potter and Terry Brooks's I said autocorrect killed me here. It says Shannara, Terry Brooks' Shannara series. The most famous depiction of gnomes is the style we associate in the 21st century with garden gnomes. They are short, portly humanoids, often old bearded men with red hats. Garden gnomes are a continuation of an old tradition of small garden statues that go back to at least Roman times. But gnomes as we'd recognize them are from the mid-19th century. This representation, the garden and nature spirit rather than the early goblin-like creature, is what we generally think about when we think of gnomes. Part of that is also because of the books written by Will Hagen and Rien Poetvliet. Their first book was simply called Gnomes and was styled like a biology textbook or field manual. The book described in detail the lives and habits of the creatures and was first published in 1976 in Dutch and was translated the next year to English in 1977. I loved this original book. I read it from my school library in the late 80s. I seem to recall a similar series about all sorts of fey creatures. I actually need to look them up because they were beautifully illustrated and fascinating. There was a whole series of books about the gnomes by Hagen and Poortvliet, which culminated in the TV series David the Gnome in 1985. Growing up in South Africa in the 80s, it was transmitted in Afrikaans when it was called Dawie die Kabouter. I was often given that nickname myself, being called David. And I hated it, so please don't anyone take that as an invitation. But what about Buddy? What kind of creatures did he find in his dad's barn/garage/workshop? Now, people familiar with nature spirits will know that they're funny things. I'm sure you know that. They aren't exactly formless, but they are tricksy and they tend to be seen whenever they choose to appear. And they appear pretty much as anything they like. They can also see into the mind of those looking at them and appear in the way that they may be expected. So when Buddy looked into the shadows of the barn workshop garage and saw the movements of something that didn't seem to be an animal, he expected to see a garden gnome. They didn't have any garden gnomes in his yard, but his grandmother had a whole family of them that fascinated Buddy. She had told him that they came alive at night to explore and tend the garden, that they would go into the garden shed to get tools and clear weeds and trim the flower beds. And Buddy knew that although he was only there once a week, he never saw anyone working in the garden and it was always impeccable, so he had no reason not to believe his grandmother. So when he saw the little nature spirits skittering around, he saw what he expected. It was a group of little men and women in red pointy hats. The men had longish grey hair and long grey beards, and the women had their hair tightly bound in buns and was mostly dark brown to dark grey. There were even a couple of younger gnomes, men and women, and some that were a little bit harder to tell, as if they hadn't decided what they were yet. They looked at the curious boy with his untidy brown hair and brown eyes that saw so clearly. They looked at each other to see the forms that they had taken on at his prompting, at his subconscious, and they giggled in delight. They tickled each other vigorously, their pointed hats bobbing and swaying, and they scuffled around and wrestled in the dust. And so after a few minutes of wrestling and enjoying their Buddy-inspired shapes, they stopped their play and they spoke to Buddy. They asked his name and they chatted about him. "What's your name, young man, young master? We've seen you around the yard, but where do you come from?" Buddy thought seriously. "Oh, my name is Buddy, and I'd come from here. This is my house. Where do you come from?" One of the younger gnomes, or younger seeming gnomes rather, because honestly who knows how old these creatures were, stepped forward, and he seemed to want to communicate the most. He said, "We don't actually live around here. We live in a cave not too far from here, but in the really dark part of the forest. We like to come and visit and play with the toys and the tools. We climb on the cars and dig around, and we steal nails and screws because they are useful for us. We don't make them ourselves very often. It's just easier to borrow," he says, looking a little bit guilty about it, "and use them to build homes for ourselves in our caves, to help protect us as well against our rivals, the goblins, which also live deep down under the earth with us." But he looked fascinated. "You have goblins as well? They are goblins as well? What are they like?" The gnomes looked a little bit troubled. "They're a bit like us, we suppose. Maybe a little bit bigger, but much uglier. And they're lazy. They can't even come out in the sun, so they come and steal from us, but we borrow from you. So anything we borrow that doesn't come back, it's completely their fault. Just just so you know. But Buddy wasn't one to judge. The guilty conscience of the gnomes really didn't concern him at all. He just thought the story was completely fascinating. They liked climbing around the cars and the trucks, and he played around with them for a while. He scratched on... They helped get some tools that were caught behind some of the cabinets out that his father had dropped. And after a while, they sat down to have a long conversation. The young gnome, who introduced himself as Barry... No, I'm going with Freddy. Barry's too similar to Buddy. Freddy the gnome, who seemed to be not the leader but the spokesman, sat with Buddy, and they spoke about their lives together, or their lives that they had with their own people. Buddy told Freddy about the time he spent with his family, about his mother and his sisters and his brothers and his father. The gnomes knew his father quite well. They also used to come and sit and watch him work and swear and say bad words and complain and grumble. And they always got very excited whenever he was fiddling around on his car and got it working and running. They may have been they may have tended slightly towards stealing, but they were good-hearted creatures who loved to see joy, and they loved how much Buddy's father loved working on his vehicle, because they are also very clever creatures who love to build and create, so they love to see it in others. They also said they used to love watching Buddy come and sneak in the corner and watch his father, because Buddy adored his father very much and loved to watch him work, and the gnomes loved to watch Buddy watch his father. So for this reason, when they saw him, they weren't at all scared. They knew that he was a friendly young boy with open nature and a warm heart, and so they allowed him to see them. So after a while, Buddy asked Freddy the gnome, if he could come and see their cave. He wanted to try catch a glimpse of the goblins that lived deep down. The gnomes didn't seem particularly scared of the goblins, although they didn't like them. They just didn't like that they stole from them. And Freddy said that this would actually be a pleasure. Well, he said that he would have to check with the king of the gnomes first, but he didn't think that it would be a problem. It was too late to go today, but they would leave, they would go see the king, and they would come fetch Buddy tomorrow if they could, or they would tell him if they couldn't. It was getting late, and it was time for the gnomes to get home, so they took a few nails and screws. They borrowed a few nails and screws, said that they would definitely return them if the goblins didn't steal them, and made off into the forest. Now, Buddy knew better than to tell anybody about his plans for the next day. He knew not many others believed in the creatures in the forest that he was so sure was real. And I mean, he knew these ones were real because he had spent the day with them. Not really something to argue with. But he thought it would probably be a bad idea to tell his mother and father and his older siblings about the fact that he is planning a trip the next day to go into a cave, to go visit the king of the gnomes and go peek and look at some goblins deep under the earth. He knew they wouldn't believe him, and he knew that they would probably try to keep him home because they wouldn't believe that it was safe. Now, if you listen to the first episode where we introduced our friend Buddy, I did promise that Buddy always would be safe, and I'm going to keep that promise today. I guess it's a spoiler of sorts, but Buddy will return home safe and sound, and no one will even know that he was gone. So if you're a little bit concerned about his future, don't be. He will be fine. Don't be like Buddy's parents. And try get him to stay home because of not knowing what he was going to do. And so that night, Buddy had dinner and he had a warm bath, and he went to bed. He was very excited about the day ahead, so he didn't get to sleep too early, but he was also quite tired because he had played quite vigorously with the gnomes in the course of the day. So eventually he fell asleep. and he slept very, very well and very, very deeply. His mother woke him up the next morning for breakfast. He had some oatmeal and some slices of bacon. He decided to put on some more robust clothing. He usually wore sneakers and shorts and stuff around the house during the day if he wasn't going to be leaving the yard. But he got his mother to put on a pair of jeans, and he wore some small boots that were perfectly fitted and really adorable. He looked like he was ready for a day in the woods, and his parents remarked on it and took photos to put on Facebook to share with their families, their photos of this little woodsman, their adorable little buddy, man of the forest. So everyone went off to do their thing. The yard was pretty secure. Buddy was probably about 6 years old at this point, I'm not too sure. So he didn't need to be supervised too closely. His younger siblings were around as well, but no one was keeping a close eye when he snuck into the barn. His family knew that he played in the barn quite a lot, and there was nothing overly dangerous there. He couldn't reach, or at least they didn't believe that he could reach, some of the more risky tools. And as it turns out, the gnomes were always in there looking after him anyway, but nobody had realized that, obviously. So Buddy went into the barn and met with Freddy and 2 of the other gnomes. Most of them hadn't come that day. They stayed home at the caves to make use of the screws and nails that they had borrowed, and were doing some work back at the cave. So Freddy came with some others, and they snuck Buddy out of the barn. The barn workshop garage was very close to the fence, quite far from the house. So there was no one to see him as he snuck between the horizontal parts, the planks of the split post fence. He went very quickly and quietly into the trees, so anyone casually glancing across wouldn't see him. The gnomes themselves were very, very sneaky. They made sure Buddy could keep an eye on them, but they just walked through, well, they were really tiny, so they just walked under bushes and through long grass, and they were completely invisible unless they wanted to be seen. So Buddy followed them. He could see them because they wanted him to see them. They were quite excited to take him to see their king, because their king was fascinated by the idea of this young man, this young boy. The king had been in the barn a few times, but mostly had duties to attend to back at the caves, and so he was rather interested to meet this young boy that he'd heard so much about. The big-hearted youngster who was so curious and so warm. It didn't take very long to reach the cave of the gnomes. The gnomes knew the best path to take our little friend Buddy on, where he wouldn't get scritched and scratched and it would be easy for him to walk. The path actually looked quite rough, but they somehow managed to make sure his footing never stumbled and he never had any problems. One of the amazing things about the gnomes that Buddy saw as they walked was that they sometimes would just dive into the earth. If there was a little mound or a little hill or a bump, they would just walk straight through it as though it wasn't there, or as if they were just dolphins jumping into water. They seemed to actually quite enjoy it. They would do tricks and jump into the sides of rocks and jump out the other side as if they were putting on a show for him. And it was something that he found quite impressive. He even felt some of the rocks and mounds that the gnomes had jumped through as if they were nothing, and they were very definitely solid. So they frolicked and gambled like dolphins at play in the waves, and Buddy followed, not even missing a step. It was almost like magic that they guided him in a way that he never fell. And so after a short while, 15 or 20 minutes, they reached the cave. While it wasn't very far from the house, it was a very deep and dark part of the woods. The trees grew close, and their branches were laced together above, almost as if they were deliberately hiding something. The cave entrance itself was quite small, It was quite high, taller than Buddy, but very narrow, and it bent in a way that obstructed, so unless you knew it was there, you wouldn't even see it. The gnomes guided him around the corner. Well, Freddy guided him around the corner. The other two gnomes just walked straight through the rocks to go straight into the cave. Again, Buddy was quite impressed. He wished he could walk through rocks the way these gnomes could. Buddy walked around the edge of the rocks into the cave. It took him a second for his eyes to adjust because it was at first very dark. There was no light that he could see at first. Freddy held up a little stick that just glowed with magical light, and Buddy could see his footing underneath. While the cave looked very rough and natural, the cave floor was very smooth, as though it saw quite a lot of traffic. He followed Freddy and the other two gnomes, who now stopped with their games of diving through rocks and earth. They were getting to see the king, so it was time to get serious. So they went in. They went deeper and deeper into the cave. Again, not for very long. It was probably 10 or 15 minutes. There was another crack very similar to the cave mouth, where the rocks bent around each other and you couldn't see through. Buddy squeezed his way through, fitting easily, off a little bit snugly, stepped out into a broad open space. There was light here. The top was open to the sky. You could see the sun shining down, and he could see the city of the gnomes and the beautiful palace. Now, I mentioned earlier that gnomes are very clever creatures. They are good with their hands and very, very crafty and great craftsmen. They were crafty in all senses of the word, and you could see this looking at their home. It didn't look like very many gnomes lived there. Probably shouldn't call it a city, more of a village. The palace was rather gorgeous, though. It was slightly higher than Buddy's head and 3 floors tall, enough space for quite a lot of gnomes to live in it, and was very intricately carved out of wood and rock. It was inlaid with gold and gems and shapes that looked like plants. The gnomes seemed to revere the earth above. They loved to make flower patterns and leaf patterns out of gems that were pink and green and red. The gnomes' homes themselves were not quite so inlaid with gems, but they were very carefully carved. They also had plants and creatures and animals and other mystical things that didn't look quite like animals or people or plants. Strange little things, the likes of which Buddy had never seen in his times in the forest. He was absolutely delighted, and the gnomes were delighted to see him too. As he saw them, they changed their shapes to be more like the gnomes that he expected. The shapes that they were before they actually weren't really shapes. They were mostly formless and misty. They seemed to enjoy looking like something, although I think it took some effort for them, so when they weren't putting on a performance for an outsider, they had the tendency to just let their shapes fall apart, and they wandered around looking like wisps and mist. But he couldn't fit into the palace. He wasn't the tallest boy, but he was a lot taller than even the tallest of the gnomes, so the king came out to see him. Although we call him a king, maybe a chieftain or something is more like it. He didn't have much in the way of airs and graces, and he didn't act like he was important or royalty. He was just a gnome with a job to do, a community to look after, and some responsibilities, and a slightly shinier house. Good day, friend Buddy. I've seen you before, although we've never met, but I've heard quite a lot about you from Freddy and the other gnomes who you spoke to yesterday. They enjoyed their time with you very much, and we welcome you here to our home. Thank you very much, Your Highness, said Buddy. He knew well that you need to be very polite to adults at the best of times, and to kings even more at the best of times. The king and the other gnomes were charmed. They laughed and clapped, and they were very excited to have him with them. So, young buddy, Freddy and the others tell me that you wish to go and see the goblins who live even deeper under the earth than we do, and who come and steal the nails and screws that we borrow from you. Oh, yes, I would love that very much if you think it would be okay, said Buddy. I don't want to put anybody out, and I don't want to be inconvenient, and if there's any risks or danger... Oh, don't worry, said the king, King Angus. We will be very sneaky, and the goblins won't even know we're there, and even if they spot us, they're really no real danger. They make a lot of noise and hissing, but they don't really like to fight. All right then, I would love to see that, if you would be so kind. So the king nodded to Freddy and the other two gnomes, Crystal and Cheryl, who had come to take him from the barn, and he told them they could go. The king unfortunately couldn't go with because he had duties to attend to. Up the far side of the gnome settlement, there was another tunnel. This one wasn't quite as well hidden as the ones coming in. It actually even had posts and a lintel. It could be seen that you could see that it was a doorway into the earth. It was a little bit low, but Buddy could get in, bending his head only slightly, and then on the far side he could stand up straight. Freddy and Cheryl and Crystal went ahead, sneaking very quietly. Go quiet, Freddy whispered. Very quiet, confirmed Cheryl. Buddy watched his step. The floor here was a little bit rougher, but he was an active boy and very, very good on his feet. They went down, they snuck around. After a while, Freddy extinguished the light on the stick that he'd been carrying, the magical glow that came from nowhere. They could see further down the tunnel that there was a glow coming from around the corner. It was flickering in yellow like firelight. Freddy beckoned in the gloom for Buddy to follow. Cheryl and Crystal stayed behind. Freddy went down hunched and Buddy crawled, and they stuck their heads around the corner and took a look. They could see the goblins mining away at the rock face, digging out precious gems. The goblins actually did look a lot like the gnomes. They seemed a little bit taller and skinnier and slightly more bent, but they otherwise looked like people. They also had long beards, but they were scragglier. They wore clothing that was rougher, and they had long fingernails, but they were also very good with tools. They pulled the gems out very skillfully, handed them off to another goblin who straight away was polishing them up and forming them into beautiful shapes. Not much else was going on. The goblins were just mining and polishing, and they took a break for a while and had something to eat and drink. After about an hour or so of watching, Buddy realized there wasn't much more that was going to happen. So he tapped Freddy on the shoulder and pointed away from the goblins. He thought it was probably time to go home before anybody missed him. So Freddy and Buddy sneaked away, met up with Cheryl and Crystal, and went back to the gnome settlement. Good day, Buddy. Hello again, said King Angus. Did you enjoy your trip to see our neighbours, the goblins? Oh, I did very much, said Buddy. Thank you, sir, for your permission and for your help. Thank you to Freddy and Cheryl and Crystal for coming with me. Well, you're most welcome, and you can come again and see us any time you wish. Just give a whistle at the edge of the forest, and Freddy or another gnome will come and fetch you. But you probably better be getting home before anybody notices you're gone. That's very right. Thank you, King Angus, said Buddy. He bowed very deeply and very politely to the king, who clapped his hands in delight, because gnomes were not very big ones for rituals, so that sort of thing didn't happen a lot. He bowed not quite so deeply in return, and turned and went into his palace. Freddy and Cheryl and Carol took Buddy, and they left. They left the caves. They left the woods. wasn't very long before they were back at Buddy's house, back in his yard, back in the barn/workshop/garage. "Thank you very much for taking me today," said Buddy to his good friend Freddie and his new acquaintances Cheryl and Carol, who had gotten to know quite well. "You're most welcome," said Freddie. "You're so welcome," said Cheryl and Carol. "We will see you again soon." Buddy sat in the barn for a little while, thinking about the day he'd had, and then realized he was hungry, and he went for lunch. Thank you for joining me on this episode of the Sleepy Time Tales podcast, the sleep aid podcast designed around a bedtime story to help you get a restful night. New episodes will be released every Sunday night to give you something fresh to help you in a new week, and as I mentioned up front, I'm going to be releasing a few extra episodes to help build up an archive so that there's more options for you, the listener, to leave running in the background. So once you've subscribed on your podcatcher of choice, keep an eye on your feed to see what new stuff I release. I just want to highlight again that tonight's music is Un Désert by Kumiku from the Free Music Archive. Check out more of their work on their website and their Patreon, which you will find linked in the show notes. Good night and sweet dreams.